I'm Angelica Rivers, 23, a decorated soldier who left home for the military because structure and service made more sense to me than the performances at our Kitley table. For years, I wired money home, covered bills, and kept my family's reputation intact while I built a life on my own terms. But while I was deployed, they announced I had died in action, held a funeral, and started cashing insurance checks, so I walked into my own service in full uniform and let the truth land. Have you ever been used or betrayed by the people you trusted most? If so, drop your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive in, tell me where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, tap like and subscribe. What happened next might surprise you. I was 8 years old the first time I realized my parents measured love in currency. My father stood in our cramped Kitley, calculator in one hand, bills scattered across the Formica counter like fallen leaves. My mother hovered beside him, her fingers drumming against her crossed arms, both of them speaking in hushed tones about mortgage payments and credit card statements. When I asked if we could get the new bike I'd seen at the store, they turned to me with identical expressions of exasperation. "Money doesn't grow on trees, Angelica," my mother said, her voice carrying that familiar edge of disappointment. Maybe if you understood what it takes to keep this family afloat. Even then, something about their response felt wrong. Other parents seemed to find ways to say no without making their children feel like burdens. But in our house, every request was met with a lecture about financial responsibility, every need weighed against the family's precarious balance sheet. My childhood was a series of lessons in scarcity, even when abundance was possible. My father worked as a mid-level insurance adjuster, my mother as a part-time bookkeeper. Their income was modest but steady, yet they spoke constantly of being on the verge of financial ruin. They clipped coupons obsessively, bought generic brands exclusively, and turned off lights with military precision. But they also subscribed to expensive cable packages and bought new cars every few years, contradictions that confused me then and disturb me now. The house itself reflected their priorities. The front yard was meticulously maintained, the exterior painted and pressure-washed annually. Inside, behind closed doors, carpet frayed at the edges and appliances wheezed through their final years. Appearances mattered more than substance, a lesson they taught without words. My younger brother Mark absorbed this philosophy differently than I did. Where I internalized their criticism and worked harder for approval, he learned to manipulate their system. He would break something deliberately, then charm his way out of consequences. He understood instinctively that their love was transactional, and he became skilled at making favorable trades. I chose a different path. I earned straight A's, kept my room spotless, and never asked for anything unless absolutely necessary. I thought excellence would eventually earn their respect, their genuine pride rather than the performative version they displayed at parent-teacher conferences. When teachers praised my work ethic, my parents would nod and smile, accepting credit for raising such a disciplined child. But at home, achievement was expected, not celebrated. High school intensified these patterns. While my classmates navigated typical teenage rebellion, I maintained perfect attendance and graduated valedictorian. My parents attended the ceremony, dressed in their best clothes, beaming as I delivered my speech. Afterward, at the reception, I watched them accept congratulations from other families, discussing my college prospects and future earning potential with obvious satisfaction. "Angelica's always been focused," my mother told Mrs. Henderson from down the street. We taught her early that success requires sacrifice. The word sacrifice echoed in my mind during those conversations. They spoke as if they had made sacrifices for my success, but I couldn't identify what they had given up. If anything, my achievements had enhanced their social standing without costing them anything tangible. College presented new challenges, primarily financial ones. Despite my academic record, scholarships covered only partial tuition. My parents made it clear that any gaps would be my responsibility. I worked 3 part-time jobs, studied between shifts, and graduated summa cum laude with a degree in criminal justice. The debt was manageable, but the exhaustion was profound. During those college years, my relationship with my parents became increasingly distant. Phone calls were brief and functional, focused on grades and job prospects rather than personal experiences or emotional support. They seemed most interested in my life when it reflected well on them or offered potential financial benefit. The decision to join the military wasn't sudden, but it was decisive. I craved structure, purpose, and the kind of clear expectations that my childhood had promised, but never delivered. The military offered all of that, plus immediate employment and eventual educational benefits. When I announced my decision at a family dinner during my final semester, the response was mixed. "The military," my father said, setting down his fork with deliberate precision. "That's dangerous work, Angelica. Have you considered something more stable?" My mother's concerns were different. "What about your student loans? And how will this affect your long-term career prospects?" Mark, now a high school senior, was the only one who seemed genuinely impressed. "That's actually pretty cool," he said, earning sharp looks from both parents. The conversation that followed revealed their true concerns. They weren't worried about my safety or happiness, they were calculating the impact on their own lives. My military salary would be modest compared to what they had hoped I might earn in a corporate career. My deployments would limit my ability to provide financial support or enhance their social status through my achievements. "We just want what's best for you," my mother said finally, but her tone suggested disappointment rather than support. I enlisted 3 months after graduation. Basic training was physically demanding but emotionally liberating. For the first time in my adult life, I was surrounded by people who evaluated performance based on objective standards rather than familial expectations. Merit meant something concrete here, advancement followed clear pathways, and respect was earned through competence and character. My parents attended my graduation from basic training, dressed appropriately and carrying themselves with the dignity they reserved for public occasions. They took photos, shook hands with my commanding officers, and expressed pride in my transformation from civilian to soldier. But privately, they seemed uncomfortable with my new confidence and the obvious respect I commanded from my peers. "You seem different," my mother said during the drive back to their hotel. "More serious. More military," my father added, and I couldn't tell if he meant it as criticism or observation. The change was real. Military service had given me something my childhood never had, a clear understanding of my own worth, independent of others' opinions or financial considerations. I was good at this work, respected for my judgment and valued for my contributions. It was intoxicating after a lifetime of conditional approval. My first deployment came 8 months later to a forward operating base in Afghanistan. The work was challenging and occasionally dangerous, but it reinforced everything I loved about military service. Decisions mattered, competence was rewarded, and the mission provided clear purpose. I thrived in that environment, earning commendations and the respect of both superiors and subordinates. Communication with my family during that deployment followed predictable patterns. My parents' emails focused on their daily activities and neighborhood news, with occasional questions about my safety that felt obligatory rather than heartfelt. They seemed more interested in being able to tell others that their daughter was serving overseas than in understanding what that service actually entailed. When I returned stateside, they hosted a welcome home dinner, inviting extended family and neighbors to celebrate my service. I sat at their dining room table, still adjusting to civilian surroundings, while they recounted stories of worry and pride that bore little resemblance to our actual communications during my deployment. "We hardly slept," my mother told my aunt, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. Every news report from that region made us terrified for her safety. The performance was flawless, but I remembered the reality: months between phone calls, delayed responses to my emails, and conversations that rarely lasted more than 15 minutes. Their concern had been abstract, their pride conditional, and their support largely theoretical. But I was home, whole and proud of my service. That had to be enough. During the weeks that followed, subtle changes in family dynamics became apparent. My parents asked detailed questions about my military benefits, particularly health insurance and educational opportunities. They wondered aloud about my housing allowances and deployment pay. When I mentioned signing up for life insurance through the military, their interest sharpened noticeably. "That's smart," my father said. You're in a dangerous profession now. It's important to plan ahead. Their questions felt invasive, but I attributed them to parental concern rather than anything more troubling. Parents worry about their children's financial security, especially when those children have chosen careers that involve risk. I answered their questions honestly, sharing details about my benefits package and long-term career prospects. Looking back, I should have recognized the warning signs then. But at 23, fresh from my first successful deployment and proud of my service, I wanted to believe their interest reflected genuine care rather than calculation. I wanted to trust that the people who had raised me were capable of love that existed independent of financial consideration. That trust would prove to be my most expensive mistake. The transition back to stateside duty was smoother than I had anticipated. I was assigned to a training unit at Fort Bragg, working with new recruits and finding satisfaction in helping shape the next generation of soldiers. My performance evaluations were excellent, my fitness scores consistently high, and I was selected for additional leadership training that would position me for future advancement. My family's response to these achievements was increasingly strange. They celebrated my promotions, but seemed more interested in the corresponding pay raises than in the professional recognition they represented. When I mentioned being considered for Special Forces training, their first questions weren't about the prestige or challenge of the program, but about the hazard pay and additional benefits that would come with such an assignment. "You're doing so well," my mother said during one of our rare phone calls. "We're proud of you, sweetheart. Just promise us you'll be careful about taking unnecessary risks." The word unnecessary struck me as odd. Risk was inherent in military service, and the training I was pursuing was designed to minimize that risk through superior preparation and skill development. But their concerns seemed focused more on protecting their investment than protecting me. During my next leave, I spent a week at my childhood home, sleeping in my old room and trying to reconnect with my family. The house looked the same, but the atmosphere felt different. My parents were more attentive than usual, asking about my future plans and career goals with unprecedented interest. They wanted to know about my deployment schedule, my life insurance beneficiaries, and my will. "Have you updated your paperwork since joining?" my father asked over dinner one evening. "It's important to keep that stuff current." Mark, now in college himself, seemed uncomfortable with these conversations. During a rare moment alone, he pulled me aside with obvious concern. "They've been talking about your insurance stuff a lot lately," he said quietly. "Like, a weird amount. It's kind of creepy." I dismissed his concerns at the time, attributing them to typical family dysfunction rather than anything sinister. My parents had always been focused on financial security. It made sense that they would encourage me to maintain proper insurance coverage and estate planning. Most parents would do the same for children in high-risk professions. But the conversation stayed with me, particularly Mark's obvious discomfort with our parents' behavior. He had always been more perceptive about family dynamics than I was, less willing to excuse their peculiarities as normal parental concern. His warning should have prompted more careful consideration of their motives. Instead, I returned to my duties at Fort Bragg, throwing myself into training and preparation for my next deployment. The work was demanding but rewarding, and my commanding officers continued to express confidence in my abilities and potential. I was building a career I could be proud of, surrounded by colleagues who respected my contributions and valued my presence. The contrast between my military family and my biological family became more apparent with each interaction. My fellow soldiers cared about my welfare, celebrated my successes without calculation, and offered support during difficult periods without expecting anything in return. Their loyalty was earned and reciprocated, based on shared values and mutual respect rather than blood relations or financial obligation. My parents' calls during this period became more frequent, but also more focused on specific topics. They wanted regular updates on my health, my assignment status, and my deployment schedule. They asked about my living situation, my emergency contacts, and my financial planning with the persistence of insurance investigators rather than concerned parents. "We just want to make sure you're taking care of yourself," my mother would say, but their questions felt more like data collection than expressions of love. The most disturbing conversation occurred about 3 months before my second deployment. My father called unexpectedly, ostensibly to check on my well-being, but quickly steering the discussion toward my life insurance policy. "Have you increased your coverage since your promotion?" he asked. "With your higher salary, you might want to adjust the payout amounts." When I asked why he was so interested in my insurance details, he claimed to be helping me plan for the future. But his knowledge of military benefits and insurance options was surprisingly detailed for someone who had never served. He had clearly researched these topics extensively, and his advice seemed calculated to maximize potential payouts rather than provide appropriate coverage for my actual needs. After that conversation, I began paying closer attention to my family's behavior and motivations. What I had previously attributed to protective concern now seemed more like predatory interest. They were tracking my career progression, my benefit increases, and my risk exposure with the attention of actuaries rather than parents. The realization was gradual but inevitable. My family valued me more as a financial asset than as a daughter or sister. My success enhanced their social standing, my military service provided them with bragging rights, and my insurance policies offered them potential financial security. But their interest in my actual well-being, my happiness, or my personal fulfillment was minimal at best. This understanding changed everything about our relationship. I began limiting the information I shared with them, deflecting their questions about my benefits and assignments. I stopped calling home regularly, and when they called me, I kept conversations brief and superficial. The emotional distance that had always existed between us became a deliberate barrier rather than an unfortunate circumstance. My second deployment orders came through in early spring, with a departure date in late summer. The assignment was to a more dangerous region than my previous deployment, with higher risk levels, but also greater opportunities for advancement and recognition. It was exactly the kind of challenge I had trained for, and I was eager to prove myself in a more demanding environment. When I told my family about the deployment, their reactions were revealing. Mark expressed genuine concern for my safety and made me promise to stay in touch. My parents, however, seemed almost excited by the news, asking detailed questions about the duration of the deployment, the nature of the mission, and the associated risks. "We'll worry about you every day," my mother said, but her tone suggested anticipation rather than anxiety. As my deployment date approached, their behavior became increasingly strange. They insisted on having dinner together more frequently, took numerous photos of family gatherings, and spoke often about how proud they were of my service. But these expressions of family unity felt forced and performative, as if they were creating a narrative rather than experiencing genuine emotion. The most unsettling incident occurred 2 weeks before my departure. I came home unexpectedly to find my parents going through my personal papers, including copies of my military records and insurance documents. When I confronted them, they claimed to be organizing my files as a favor, but their explanations were unconvincing and their embarrassment obvious. "We were just trying to help," my father said, but he couldn't meet my eyes. That night, I moved all of my important documents to a secure location off base and changed my emergency contact information to exclude my parents. Something was very wrong with their behavior, and I wasn't going to leave them with access to sensitive information while I was deployed overseas. My departure was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late August. The night before, my family hosted what they called a farewell dinner, complete with my favorite foods and a cake decorated with military insignia. Extended family members attended, neighbors stopped by to wish me well, and my parents delivered heartfelt speeches about their love and pride. But throughout the evening, I felt like I was watching a performance rather than participating in a genuine family gathering. Their emotions seemed rehearsed, their tears carefully timed, and their expressions of love hollow despite their apparent sincerity. I went through the motions of gratitude and affection, but internally, I was already gone. The flight to my deployment location was long and uncomfortable, but I welcomed the physical distance from my family's increasingly troubling behavior. Whatever was happening at home, I would deal with it when I returned. For now, I had a mission to focus on and colleagues who depended on my competence and reliability. I couldn't have imagined that by the time I landed, my family would already be planning my funeral. 3 months into my deployment, communication from home decreased dramatically. My parents, who had initially sent frequent emails and care packages, became nearly silent. Mark still wrote occasionally, but his messages were brief and seemed strained. When I asked about our parents' silence, he gave vague responses about them being busy with work and personal projects. The change was concerning, but not unprecedented. Families sometimes struggled with the emotional demands of having a deployed relative, and some found it easier to maintain distance rather than confront their fears. I attributed their silence to this common phenomenon and focused on my mission responsibilities. My unit was stationed at a remote forward operating base, conducting reconnaissance and security operations in a region known for insurgent activity. The work was challenging and occasionally dangerous, but exactly the kind of assignment I had trained for. My performance evaluations were excellent, and my commanding officer had mentioned the possibility of recommending me for commendation upon completion of the deployment. The isolation of our location meant that internet access was limited and often unreliable. We could send brief emails during scheduled communication windows, but extended conversations were impossible. Most of us fell into patterns of minimal contact with home, saving our communication time for essential updates rather than lengthy personal conversations. It was during one of these brief communication windows that I encountered the first sign of something seriously wrong. A fellow soldier approached me after checking his social media accounts, his expression confused and concerned. "Angelica, this is going to sound weird, but I think I saw something online about you," he said, pulling out his phone. "There was a post about a soldier from your hometown, but the details were all wrong." He showed me a screen, displaying a Facebook post from someone I didn't recognize. The post mentioned a local military member who had been killed in action, but the name was partially obscured and the details were vague. My first instinct was to dismiss it as a case of mistaken identity or rumor, but something about his expression suggested there was more to the story. "Can you access more details?" I asked. He spent the next few minutes navigating various social media platforms, following links and searching for additional information. What he found was deeply disturbing: multiple posts and news articles reporting my death in action, complete with details about my service record and hometown connections. My hands shook as I read the reports. The information was accurate enough to be convincing: my unit designation, my deployment location, even my military specialty were correctly reported. But I was very much alive, sitting in a dusty communications tent 12,000 miles from home, reading about my own demise with growing horror and disbelief. "This has to be a mistake," I said, but even as I spoke the words, I knew the truth was more sinister. We spent the next hour gathering additional information from various online sources. The reports were widespread and consistent, suggesting a coordinated effort rather than a simple error. News outlets in my hometown had picked up the story, posting articles about my military service and ultimate sacrifice. Social media was filled with condolences and tributes from people I had never met, praising my dedication and mourning my loss. But the most damning evidence came from my own family's social media accounts. My parents had posted lengthy tributes to my memory, sharing photos from my childhood and military career with heartbreaking captions about their grief and pride. My mother had updated her profile status to reflect her loss, and my father had shared articles about military families coping with combat deaths. The posts were recent, uploaded within the past week while I had been conducting routine patrols and training exercises. They weren't responding to my death, they were announcing it, creating it, crafting a narrative that served their purposes while I remained completely unaware of their actions. Reading their words was surreal and nauseating. They wrote about their pride in my service, their devastation at my loss, and their determination to honor my memory. The language was eloquent and emotionally compelling, designed to generate sympathy and support from their community. But every word was a lie, and I was alive to witness their deception. The implications hit me gradually, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. This wasn't a mistake or misunderstanding, it was a deliberate fraud. My parents had declared me dead, presumably to collect on life insurance policies and generate sympathy from their community. They had calculated that my actual death was unnecessary if they could convincingly fake it and collect the benefits. I sat in that communications tent, surrounded by the sounds of normal military operations, trying to process the magnitude of their betrayal. These were the people who had raised me, who claimed to love me, who had attended my deployment ceremonies with apparent pride and concern. And they had decided that I was worth more to them dead than alive. The soldier who had discovered the posts watched me with obvious concern as I struggled to comprehend what I was reading. When I explained the situation, his expression shifted from confusion to anger on my behalf. "This is fraud," he said simply. "Insurance fraud, probably mail fraud, definitely identity fraud. This is serious federal crime stuff." I knew he was right, but the legal implications seemed secondary to the emotional devastation I was experiencing. My own parents had written my obituary while I was still alive, had mourned my death while collecting condolences and presumably filing insurance claims. They had grieved publicly while celebrating privately, performing sorrow while calculating profit. The betrayal was so complete, so coldly calculated, that I struggled to process it emotionally. I had always known my parents were flawed, had always felt like their love was conditional and transactional. But I had never imagined them capable of such elaborate deception, such complete disregard for my actual welfare. As word spread through my unit about the situation, my fellow soldiers rallied around me with genuine outrage and support. They understood immediately that this wasn't just family drama, but serious criminal behavior that needed to be addressed through official channels. Their anger on my behalf was comforting and validating. These people, who had known me for months rather than years, were more horrified by my parents' actions than my parents had been by the idea of my death. My commanding officer was briefed on the situation within hours. His response was swift and professional: immediate communication with military legal services, coordination with relevant law enforcement agencies, and arrangements for emergency leave to address the situation. The military takes care of its own, especially when that care has been violated by civilians. But as I prepared to return home and confront my family's fraud, one question haunted me above all others: how long had they been planning this? Had they started the process immediately after my deployment, or had they been laying groundwork for months, waiting for the right opportunity to cash in on my death? Either way, they had made a fundamental miscalculation. They had assumed I wouldn't be coming home to expose their lies. They were about to discover just how wrong they had been. The flight home was the longest 26 hours of my life. Military transport doesn't accommodate emotional crises, and I spent most of the journey staring out small windows at clouds and ocean, trying to process the full scope of my family's betrayal. The initial shock had given way to a cold, focused anger that surprised me with its clarity and intensity. Captain Jackson, the military legal officer assigned to my case, had briefed me thoroughly before departure. The fraud was extensive and sophisticated, involving forged death certificates, false insurance claims, and coordination with funeral services. My parents hadn't simply announced my death on social media. They had created an entire infrastructure to support their deception and maximize their financial benefit. The insurance claims alone totaled over $400,000 across multiple policies. They had filed paperwork with the Department of Veterans Affairs, contacted military life insurance providers, and even reached out to supplemental policies I had purchased through private companies. The speed and efficiency of their actions suggested careful planning rather than opportunistic deception. This wasn't impulsive, Captain Jackson had explained. They knew exactly which policies you carried, understood the claims processes, and had paperwork ready to file immediately. Someone did significant research and preparation. The funeral had been scheduled for Saturday afternoon at St. Matthew's Catholic Church, the same church where I had been baptized and confirmed. My parents had chosen a closed casket service, claiming that my remains were too damaged for viewing, a convenient lie that eliminated the need for an actual body. The obituary they had submitted to local newspapers was comprehensive and touching, highlighting my military service and community connections while painting them as devoted parents devastated by loss. But perhaps the most disturbing detail was the guest list. They had invited everyone: extended family, childhood friends, former teachers, neighbors, and community leaders. This wasn't a quiet, private fraud. It was a public performance designed to maximize sympathy and social support. They wanted to be seen as grieving parents, worthy of comfort and assistance during their time of loss. During the layover in Germany, I called Mark from a secure military line. His voice was strained and exhausted, and I could hear genuine relief when he realized I was alive. "Jesus Christ, Angelica, where have you been?" he said, his voice breaking. "They said you were dead." There were military officials here, paperwork, arrangements. I've been going crazy. "What officials?" I asked, though I suspected the answer. "Nobody in uniform," he admitted. "Insurance people, mostly. And some guy who claimed to be from the Veterans Administration, but he didn't have proper identification. Mom and Dad handled all the conversations. They said I was too upset to deal with the details." Mark's account confirmed my worst suspicions. My parents had orchestrated every aspect of the fraud, controlling information flow and limiting outside contact that might expose their deception. They had presented themselves as the primary points of contact for all official business, ensuring that any questions or verification attempts would be filtered through them. "The funeral is tomorrow," Mark continued. "I can't believe they're going through with it. This feels so wrong, Angelica. Even if you were actually dead, this whole thing feels wrong." I could hear the moral conflict in his voice. He had always been more perceptive about our parents' character flaws, but even he seemed shocked by the scope of their deception. The brother I remembered as manipulative and self-centered was demonstrating more ethical clarity than the people who had raised us both. "Are you coming home?" he asked. "I'm coming home," I confirmed. "But not the way they expect." The plan Captain Jackson and I had developed was simple and direct. I would attend my own funeral in full dress uniform, accompanied by military legal personnel and federal investigators. There would be no advance warning, no opportunity for my parents to prepare explanations or escape consequences. They would face the truth publicly, in front of everyone they had deceived. The final leg of my journey took me to Raleigh-Durham Airport, where I was met by Agent Johnson from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and Agent Lee from the military's Criminal Investigation Division. Both had been working on the case since Captain Jackson had initiated the investigation, gathering evidence and coordinating with various agencies to build a comprehensive case against my parents. They filed claims with 7 different insurance companies, Agent Johnson explained as we drove toward my hometown. Total potential payout was close to $600,000. They've already received partial payments from 3 companies, with others pending verification. The scope of the fraud was staggering. My parents hadn't just exploited 1 or 2 policies, they had systematically targeted every possible source of death benefits, including some I hadn't even known existed. They had researched survivor benefits, veterans programs, and supplemental insurance policies with the thoroughness of professional criminals. "How did they get access to my policy information?" I asked. Agent Lee consulted his notes. "Combination of methods. Some information they had from family discussions, some they obtained by posing as representatives of your estate, and some they accessed through documents you had stored at their house. They've been collecting information for months, possibly longer." The betrayal felt fresh with each new detail. Every conversation about my military benefits, every question about my insurance coverage, every request to update my paperwork had been part of their preparation for this fraud. They had been planning my death for months while I was risking my actual life in service to my country. As we approached the church, I could see cars lining the street and people gathering in small groups outside the main entrance. The community had responded to news of my death with genuine sorrow and support, bringing flowers, food, and condolences to honor my service and comfort my grieving family. These people were innocent victims of my parents' deception, manipulated into participating in a performance they believed was real. I checked my appearance in the car's mirror. My dress uniform was impeccable, my ribbons and insignia properly aligned, my bearing professional and composed. I looked like exactly what I was, a decorated soldier returning from deployment, alive and ready to confront the people who had betrayed her trust and exploited her service. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was about to walk into my own funeral to expose the people who had raised me. In some ways, It felt like the end of my childhood and the beginning of something else entirely, a life defined by my own choices rather than their expectations, my own values rather than their calculations. Agent Johnson parked the car near the church entrance, positioning us for maximum impact when we made our entrance. Through the car windows, I could see my relatives and family friends gathering in the vestibule, dressed in black and speaking in hushed tones appropriate to the occasion. "Are you ready for this?" Agent Lee asked. I straightened my uniform jacket and took a deep breath. I've been ready for this my entire life. The church was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and in the aisles to accommodate everyone who had come to pay their respects. I recognized faces from throughout my childhood, teachers, neighbors, family friends, and relatives I hadn't seen in years. The turnout was overwhelming, a testament to the respect my military service had earned and the affection people felt for what they believed was my memory. My parents sat in the front pew, dressed appropriately in black and maintaining expressions of dignified grief. My mother dabbed periodically at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, while my father sat rigidly upright, his jaw set in what appeared to be stoic determination to endure this painful ceremony. Mark sat beside them, clearly uncomfortable but playing his assigned role in their performance. The pastor was midway through his eulogy when Agent Johnson, Agent Lee, and I entered through the main doors. The sound of our footsteps on the marble floor seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed sanctuary, and heads began turning toward the disturbance. Whispers started in the back rows and spread forward like ripples in a pond. I walked down the center aisle in full military bearing, my chin high and my pace steady. The agents flanked me professionally, their presence clearly official and their purpose unmistakable to anyone familiar with law enforcement. As recognition dawned on the faces around us, gasps echoed through the church, followed by complete, stunned silence. My mother saw me first. Her handkerchief dropped from nerveless fingers, and her face went absolutely white. She grabbed my father's arm with such force that he turned to see what had startled her, following her horrified gaze to where I stood in the aisle, very much alive and visibly angry. My father's reaction was different, but equally revealing. His face didn't drain of color like my mother's. Instead, it hardened into an expression of calculation, as if he was rapidly considering options and consequences. Even in this moment of complete exposure, he was thinking tactically rather than emotionally. The pastor had stopped speaking entirely, staring at me with obvious confusion and growing understanding. The entire congregation was frozen in place, watching this impossible scene unfold before them. Some people were standing for a better view, others were reaching for their phones to document what they were witnessing. I stopped 10 feet from the front pew and spoke in a clear, carrying voice that reached every corner of the church. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, "but I believe you're mourning someone who isn't actually dead." The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved, no one whispered, no one even seemed to breathe. The weight of realization was settling over the congregation like a heavy blanket, and I could see understanding dawn on faces throughout the sanctuary. Agent Johnson stepped forward and spoke with professional authority that cut through the shocked silence. "Whoever filed the false death report that prompted this service is going to prison," he announced. "This is an ongoing federal investigation into insurance fraud, identity fraud, and mail fraud. Anyone with information about these crimes should contact the FBI immediately." My mother collapsed then, not gracefully or dramatically, but with the boneless surrender of someone whose entire world had just imploded. She slumped against my father, who caught her automatically but continued staring at me with that same calculating expression. Mark jumped up to help her, but his eyes never left my face, and I could see relief mixed with horror in his expression. The congregation erupted in chaos. People were standing, pointing, talking loudly, and pushing toward the aisles for better views or quicker exits. Cell phones appeared throughout the sanctuary as people began documenting and sharing what they were witnessing. The careful solemnity of the funeral service had transformed into something between a crime scene and a spectacle. Pastor Hendricks, who had baptized me 18 years earlier, approached with obvious confusion and concern. "Angelica? We were told you had been killed in Afghanistan. Your parents said military officials had confirmed your death." I've been very much alive in Afghanistan, I replied. I'm here on emergency leave to address this situation. The pastor's confusion shifted to understanding and then to anger as he grasped the full scope of the deception. He had performed funeral services for dozens of military members over the years, providing genuine comfort to actual grieving families. Being manipulated into participating in this fraud was a violation of everything he represented. My father finally stood, still supporting my mother's weight, and attempted to salvage the situation. There's been a terrible misunderstanding, he began, but Agent Lee interrupted him immediately. Sir, you have the right to remain silent, Agent Lee said, producing handcuffs with practiced efficiency. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As the Miranda warnings continued, I watched my parents' faces with detached fascination. My mother seemed genuinely stunned by the turn of events, as if she had convinced herself that their fraud was somehow justified or legal. My father, however, was clearly calculating his options even as the handcuffs closed around his wrists. The congregation was now openly staring and commenting as federal agents arrested my parents in the church where I had been raised. Children were asking their parents loud questions about what was happening, teenagers were live streaming the event on social media, and adults were calling friends and family to report what they were witnessing. Mark approached me cautiously, still visibly shaken by the morning's revelations. I knew something was wrong, he said quietly. But I never imagined they would do something like this. Did you know about the insurance claims? I asked. He shook his head emphatically. I knew they were handling arrangements, but they said it was all paperwork and legal stuff that I wouldn't understand. They kept me away from the details, said I was too emotional to deal with official business. His explanation rang true. My parents had compartmentalized their fraud carefully, limiting information flow to prevent accidental exposure. Mark had been a useful but unwitting participant, providing legitimacy to their grief performance without access to the criminal details. As my parents were led away in handcuffs, the congregation began dispersing with obvious confusion and discomfort. These people had come to honor what they believed was my sacrifice and to comfort what they thought was my grieving family. Instead, they had witnessed a criminal investigation unfold in real time, discovering that the people they had come to support were criminals who had exploited their sympathy. Several family friends approached me with awkward condolences that shifted mid-sentence into expressions of relief at my survival. Mrs. Patterson from next door hugged me tightly, tears streaming down her face. We were so devastated when we heard, she said. Your parents seemed so broken up about it. How could they do something like this? It was a question I couldn't answer satisfactorily because I still didn't fully understand their motivations myself. Greed was clearly a factor, but the elaborate nature of their deception suggested something deeper, a fundamental inability to value my life except in terms of financial benefit to them. Agent Johnson approached as the church continued emptying. We'll need you to come to the field office for a complete debriefing, he said. There are additional details about the fraud that we'll need to review with you. I nodded, but my attention was focused on the altar where my photograph had been displayed surrounded by flowers and military memorabilia. The image showed me in dress uniform at my promotion ceremony, smiling confidently at the camera. Seeing it in this context, as the centerpiece of my own fraudulent funeral, was deeply unsettling. They used a good photo, Mark said, following my gaze. They spent hours going through old pictures, trying to find ones that would generate the most sympathy. Even that detail had been calculated for maximum emotional impact. Nothing about their grief had been genuine. Every element of the funeral had been designed to enhance their performance and increase community support. They had choreographed their deception with the attention to detail of professional criminals. As we prepared to leave the church, I took one final look around the sanctuary where I had attended services throughout my childhood. The building itself was innocent of my parents' crimes, but it would forever be associated with this moment of revelation and betrayal. I would never be able to enter this space again without remembering the day I attended my own funeral to expose my parents' fraud. The drive to the FBI field office gave me time to process what had just occurred. In the span of 30 minutes, I had publicly exposed my parents' deception, witnessed their arrest, and effectively ended any possibility of future reconciliation. There would be no family dinners, no holiday gatherings, no shared celebrations of future achievements. I had burned those bridges completely and permanently. But surprisingly, I felt no regret about that outcome. The revelation of their fraud had clarified something I had struggled to understand throughout my childhood. Their love had always been conditional and transactional. They had never valued me as a person, only as a source of reflected glory and potential financial benefit. Their willingness to declare me dead for insurance money was simply the logical endpoint of a relationship that had always been fundamentally exploitative. The FBI field office was austere and professional, exactly what I expected from a federal law enforcement facility. Agent Johnson escorted me to a conference room where several other investigators were waiting with boxes of documents and evidence related to my parents' fraud. The scope of this operation is impressive, Agent Martinez, the lead investigator, began without preamble. They didn't just file false insurance claims, they created an entire narrative infrastructure to support their fraud. She spread photographs across the conference table showing various documents my parents had forged or manipulated. Death certificates, military correspondence, insurance forms, and even sympathy cards they had written to themselves from imaginary well-wishers. The attention to detail was staggering and deeply disturbing. They were planning this for at least 6 months, Agent Martinez continued. We found evidence that they began researching your insurance policies and military benefits shortly after your deployment orders were announced. The timeline was damning. They had started planning my death before I had even left for Afghanistan, calculating potential profits while helping me prepare for deployment. Every expression of parental concern during those final weeks at home had been tainted by their knowledge of what they intended to do once I was overseas and unable to expose their deception. What happens to them now? I asked. Multiple federal charges, Agent Johnson replied. Insurance fraud, mail fraud, identity fraud, conspiracy, and potentially others depending on what additional evidence we uncover. They're looking at significant prison time, even with plea agreements. The legal consequences seemed appropriate but somehow insufficient. Prison time would punish them for their criminal behavior, but it couldn't repair the damage they had done to my trust, my sense of family, or my understanding of my own worth. Some injuries couldn't be addressed through the justice system. The debriefing continued for several hours, with investigators walking me through every aspect of my parents' fraud and asking detailed questions about my knowledge of their financial situation and behavior. I provided whatever information I could, but much of their planning had been hidden from me deliberately. As the session concluded, Agent Martinez handed me a card with contact information for victim services. This kind of betrayal by family members is particularly traumatic, she said. There are counseling resources available specifically for situations like this. I thanked her but wasn't sure whether I would use the services. Military culture emphasized resilience and self-reliance, and I was hesitant to seek help processing what felt like a personal failure to recognize my parents' true nature. But I kept the card, recognizing that my initial emotional numbness might give way to more complex feelings as the situation developed. Mark was waiting in the lobby when I finished with the investigators. He looked exhausted and older than his 20 years, as if the morning's revelations had aged him significantly. "Where are you staying tonight?" he asked. I hadn't considered the practical implications of my return. My childhood home was now a crime scene, my parents were in federal custody, and I had no other local connections that felt appropriate to impose upon. "I'll find a hotel," I said. "Stay with me," Mark offered. "I have an apartment near campus." It's not much, but it's better than being alone right now. His offer was generous and unexpected. Despite our different responses to our parents' behavior over the years, we had never been particularly close as siblings. But shared trauma has a way of creating bonds that didn't exist before, and I was grateful for his support. We drove to his apartment in silence, both of us processing the day's events in our own ways. The contrast between his modest student housing and our parents' carefully maintained suburban home was stark, but his space felt more honest and authentic than anywhere I had lived with our parents. "I need to ask you something," Mark said after we had settled in his living room with coffee. "Did you ever suspect they were capable of something like this?" The question had been haunting me since I first discovered their fraud, and I still didn't have a satisfactory answer. I knew they were focused on money, I said carefully. I knew their love felt conditional. But I never imagined they would fake my death for insurance money. They talked about your insurance policies constantly after you deployed, Mark said. Every conversation somehow worked around to your benefits and coverage amounts. I thought it was weird, but I figured it was just typical parent worry about their kid in a dangerous job. His observation confirmed what I had already suspected. Their interest in my insurance coverage had been predatory rather than protective. They had been calculating potential profits while I was conducting combat operations, viewing my risk exposure as their financial opportunity. That evening, as I tried to sleep in Mark's spare room, I reflected on the strange turns my life had taken. 3 days earlier, I had been a deployed soldier focused on mission completion and professional advancement. Now I was back in my hometown, having exposed my parents' criminal fraud and effectively ended my relationship with the people who had raised me. But despite the traumatic nature of these revelations, I felt a curious sense of relief. The nagging doubts I had carried about my family's love and support had been resolved definitively. Their betrayal was so complete and undeniable that I no longer needed to question my own perceptions or make excuses for their behavior. For the first time in my adult life, I was free from the obligation to seek their approval or maintain their version of family unity. That freedom came at a terrible cost, but it was still freedom, and I intended to make the most of it. The next morning brought a flood of media attention that I hadn't anticipated. News of the funeral incident had spread rapidly through social media, and reporters were calling Mark's phone and knocking on his apartment door seeking interviews and additional information. Local soldier exposes parents' insurance fraud at own funeral was the headline in the regional newspaper, accompanied by photographs taken at the church and interviews with shocked congregation members. The story had everything journalists loved: family drama, military service, criminal fraud, and a dramatic confrontation scene. Agent Johnson called to warn me about the media attention and offer resources for managing public scrutiny. The FBI was accustomed to high-profile cases, but I was not prepared for the level of interest my story was generating. The narrative is very compelling, Agent Johnson explained. Military hero betrayed by greedy parents makes for powerful storytelling. But remember that you're under no obligation to speak with reporters or provide additional details beyond what's already public. I decided to avoid media interviews entirely, at least initially. The legal case was still developing, and I wanted to focus on processing the emotional implications of my parents' betrayal rather than managing public perception of the situation. But the attention did serve one positive purpose. It connected me with other military members who had experienced family exploitation or betrayal. Several veterans reached out through military networks to share similar stories and offer support. I learned that family financial exploitation of deployed military members was more common than I had realized, though rarely as elaborate as my parents' scheme. One message particularly resonated with me. A senior non-commissioned officer wrote, "The people who birthed you don't automatically deserve your loyalty or trust. Family is something you build, not something you inherit. You'll find your real family among people who value your life more than your death benefits." His words helped crystallize something I had been struggling to articulate about my experience. My parents' fraud hadn't just been a criminal act, it had been a complete rejection of any genuine familial bond. They had chosen money over their daughter's life, calculation over love, deception over honesty. In doing so, they had forfeited any claim to my loyalty or forgiveness. Over the following days, additional details about their fraud continued to emerge. Investigators discovered that they had researched other military families who had lost children, studying how those families had navigated insurance claims and benefit processes. They had used this research to refine their own approach, borrowing language and procedures from genuine tragedy to enhance their deception. They had also prepared contingency plans in case their fraud was discovered. Hidden bank accounts, forged documents, and even researched escape routes to countries without extradition treaties with the United States. The level of premeditation was staggering and left no room for claims of impulsive behavior or temporary moral confusion. As I learned more about the extent of their planning, my anger evolved into something colder and more permanent. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a desperate response to financial pressure. It was a calculated campaign to exploit my military service and risk exposure for their financial benefit, planned and executed with criminal sophistication. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following month, and I would be required to testify about my insurance policies, my deployment status, and my parents' access to personal information. The legal process would be lengthy and public, ensuring that the details of their betrayal would remain in the spotlight for months or years to come. But I was prepared for that scrutiny. My military training had taught me to confront difficult situations with professional composure, and this would be no different. I would testify truthfully about what my parents had done, provide whatever evidence the prosecutors needed, and accept whatever outcome the justice system produced. More importantly, I was beginning to understand that their crime had given me something valuable, absolute clarity about my priorities and relationships going forward. I would never again question whether someone's interest in me was genuine or calculating. I would never again make excuses for exploitative behavior or rationalize betrayal as misguided love. My parents had taught me a brutal but valuable lesson about the difference between family and relatives, between love and manipulation, between support and exploitation. They had intended to profit from my death, but instead they had given me the tools to build a better life without them. The legal proceedings unfolded with bureaucratic efficiency over the following months. My parents pled guilty to federal fraud charges in exchange for reduced sentences, acknowledging their crimes while offering minimal explanations for their behavior. My mother claimed they had been overwhelmed by financial pressures and had made desperate decisions. My father maintained that they had never intended to cause me harm, as if defrauding insurance companies while I was alive was somehow less offensive than doing so after I was actually dead. Their explanations rang hollow to me and apparently to the judge as well. Financial pressure might explain theft or embezzlement, but it didn't explain the elaborate nature of their deception or the coldness with which they had planned it. They had researched, prepared, and executed their fraud with the thoroughness of career criminals, not desperate parents making impulsive decisions. The sentence hearing provided my only opportunity to address them directly about their betrayal. I had prepared remarks that I hoped would convey the full impact of their actions without descending into emotional melodrama or personal attacks. "Your Honor," I began, reading from notes I had written and rewritten dozens of times, "the defendants didn't just commit insurance fraud. They declared me dead while I was serving my country, held a funeral while I was conducting combat operations, and collected sympathy from a community that believed they were grieving parents. They exploited not only insurance companies and government agencies, but also friends, relatives, and neighbors who genuinely cared about our family." I looked directly at my parents as I continued. They sat at the defendant's table in orange jumpsuits, their hands cuffed in front of them, looking older and smaller than I remembered. My mother was crying quietly, but my father maintained the same calculating expression he had worn throughout the proceedings. "But perhaps most importantly," I continued, "they taught me that some relationships aren't worth preserving, regardless of blood connections or shared history. They taught me to value the family I choose over the relatives I inherited. For that lesson, I suppose I should thank them." My mother's crying intensified at these words, but my father's expression didn't change. Even facing federal prison time, he seemed more concerned with managing the situation than with expressing genuine remorse for what they had done. The judge sentenced them to 4 years in federal prison, plus restitution to the insurance companies they had defrauded. The sentence was within the range prosecutors had recommended, acknowledging both the seriousness of their crimes and their cooperation with the investigation. As they were led away after sentencing, my mother turned back toward me with an expression of desperate appeal, as if she expected some gesture of forgiveness or reconciliation. I met her gaze steadily, but said nothing. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in court records and legal proceedings. Mark attended the sentencing hearing and sat with me throughout the proceedings. Our relationship had evolved significantly during the months since the funeral incident. Shared trauma had created a bond between us that hadn't existed during our childhood, and we had begun building an adult sibling relationship based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. Do you think you'll ever speak to them again? He asked as we left the courthouse. I don't know, I answered honestly. Right now, I can't imagine what they could say that would matter to me. I keep thinking there must have been signs we missed, Mark said. Some indication that they were capable of something like this. I had pondered the same question repeatedly, reviewing my childhood and adult interactions with our parents for warning signs I might have overlooked. But the truth was that their fraud, while extreme, was consistent with patterns of behavior they had displayed throughout our lives. They had always prioritized appearances over substance, financial considerations over emotional ones, their own needs over their children's welfare. The signs were there, I said finally. We just didn't recognize them as signs of criminal behavior. The months that followed brought unexpected opportunities for growth and connection. Military leadership had been impressed by my professional handling of a personally traumatic situation, and I was selected for advanced training programs that would accelerate my career progression. My fellow soldiers had rallied around me during the legal proceedings, providing support and friendship that felt more genuine than anything I had experienced with my biological family. I also connected with organizations that supported military families affected by financial exploitation and fraud. My story had inspired other service members to report suspicious behavior by relatives, and several additional cases had been uncovered and prosecuted. My parents' fraud had exposed a broader pattern of family exploitation that military legal services were now better equipped to address. The Victim Services Counselor Agent Martinez had recommended proved helpful in processing the complex emotions surrounding my parents' betrayal. I learned that feelings of relief, anger, and sadness could coexist without contradiction, and that healing didn't require forgiveness or reconciliation with the people who had caused harm. Your parents made choices that prioritized their financial gain over your life and welfare, the counselor explained during one of our sessions. Your response to those choices doesn't have to include maintaining a relationship with them. Family loyalty shouldn't be unconditional when family behavior is unconscionable. Her words helped validate decisions I had already made about my future relationship with my parents. I would not visit them in prison, would not maintain correspondence, and would not participate in any reconciliation efforts they might attempt. They had forfeited the right to my time, energy, and emotional investment through their own actions. As my emergency leave concluded and I prepared to return to my unit, I reflected on how profoundly the experience had changed my perspective on family, loyalty, and personal worth. My parents had intended to profit from my death, but instead they had given me life in ways they never intended. I was no longer the young woman who had sought their approval and made excuses for their behavior. I was a decorated soldier with clear boundaries, genuine friendships, and a chosen family that valued my life more than my death benefits. I was free from the obligation to maintain relationships that served others at my expense, free to build connections based on mutual respect and genuine affection. My parents were beginning 4-year prison sentences, but I was beginning the rest of my life. The contrast seemed appropriate and just. 2 years after the funeral incident, I received notification that my mother had been released early for good behavior and was requesting a meeting. The letter, forwarded through military legal services, expressed remorse for her actions and desire to rebuild our relationship. She claimed to have found religion in prison and wanted to make amends for the damage she had caused. I read the letter twice, then filed it without responding. Her desire for reconciliation was understandable, but it wasn't my responsibility to provide absolution or emotional healing for her choices. She would have to find peace with her actions through other means, because I had no interest in revisiting that relationship. My father remained in prison and had made no attempts at contact. His silence was more honest than my mother's appeals for forgiveness, acknowledging through inaction that some betrayals were too complete for repair. Mark had graduated from college and was building his own career in a different state. We maintained regular contact and had developed the kind of adult-sibling relationship that might have been impossible while navigating our parents' manipulation and exploitation. He had also declined our mother's requests for contact, choosing to focus on his future rather than relitigating the past. My military career had flourished in ways that might not have been possible if I had remained entangled in my family's drama and dysfunction. I had been promoted ahead of schedule, selected for specialized assignments, and was being considered for officer training programs that would set the trajectory for the next phase of my professional development. More importantly, I had built genuine relationships with colleagues and friends who valued my presence for reasons that had nothing to do with financial benefit or social status. These were people who celebrated my successes without calculation, supported me during difficulties without expectation of return, and trusted me with their own vulnerabilities because they understood that loyalty was reciprocal. The chosen family I had built was smaller than the biological family I had left behind, but it was infinitely more reliable and authentic. These relationships were based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection rather than accident of birth or social expectation. They required ongoing investment and care, but they provided returns that my original family never had: unconditional acceptance, honest communication, and support that didn't come with hidden costs or ulterior motives. On the third anniversary of my parents' arrest, I was stationed at a base in California, serving as a training instructor for new recruits. The work was challenging and rewarding, combining my operational experience with opportunities to shape the next generation of soldiers. My students respected my expertise and leadership, creating an environment of mutual professional regard that I found deeply satisfying. That evening, I received a message from a fellow instructor whose own family had disowned him after he came out as gay several years earlier. He had built his own chosen family among military colleagues and civilian friends, and we often discussed the parallels between our experiences of family rejection and reconstruction. "I saw the anniversary notification in your file," he wrote. "Wanted you to know that I'm thinking about you today and that I continue to be impressed by how you've handled everything. You're proof that families aren't just born, they're built." His message reminded me of how far I had traveled from the young woman who had once craved her parents' approval and made excuses for their exploitation. That person felt like a stranger to me now, someone I remembered with compassion but no longer identified with. The woman I had become was harder, perhaps, but also more authentic. I no longer sought validation from people whose love came with conditions and hidden costs. I no longer rationalized betrayal as misguided affection or accepted exploitation as normal family dynamics. I had learned to distinguish between people who valued me as a person and people who saw me as an asset to be managed or exploited. These lessons had been expensive. They had cost me my childhood illusions about family and my naive trust in blood relationships. But they had also purchased something valuable: the ability to build genuine connections based on mutual respect and shared values rather than obligation and manipulation. As I sat in my quarters that evening, reviewing training schedules for the following week and responding to messages from friends and colleagues, I realized that my parents' betrayal had given me an unexpected gift. By choosing money over their daughter's life, they had freed me to choose relationships that prioritized my welfare over their benefit. They had intended to profit from my death, but instead they had taught me how to live. The notification of my father's release came 4 years and 2 months after his sentencing. Unlike my mother, he made no attempt to contact me or request reconciliation. He simply disappeared back into civilian life, presumably to rebuild whatever existence was possible for a man convicted of defrauding insurance companies while his daughter served in a combat zone. I felt nothing upon learning of his release: no anger, no curiosity, no residual affection. He had become a stranger to me during his incarceration, and his freedom didn't change that fundamental reality. Whatever relationship we had once shared had ended the moment he chose to declare me dead for financial gain. Mark informed me that our father had moved to a different state and was working in manual labor, having lost his insurance industry license and most career prospects due to his conviction. Our mother was living with her sister in a small town several hundred miles from our childhood home, also struggling to rebuild her life after prison. "They're both pretty broken," Mark reported during one of our monthly phone calls. "I don't think either of them fully understood what they were giving up when they made those choices." His observation was probably accurate, but it didn't generate sympathy in me. My parents had made calculated decisions based on what they perceived as their best interests, prioritizing immediate financial gain over long-term family relationships. The consequences they now faced were natural results of those choices: not tragic misfortunes that had befallen them. By contrast, my own life had continued to flourish in directions that might not have been possible if I had remained entangled in their dysfunction. I had been selected for officer candidate school and was preparing to transition from enlisted service to commissioned officer status. The training was rigorous and competitive, but I thrived in environments that rewarded competence and dedication over social connections or family influence. My chosen family had also expanded to include mentors, colleagues, and friends who provided the kind of support and encouragement that healthy families should offer. These relationships required ongoing investment and care, but they generated returns in trust, loyalty, and genuine affection that my biological family had never provided. Lieutenant Colonel Angelica Rivers, my company commander and informal mentor, had taken particular interest in my professional development. Her own military career had been marked by exceptional performance and ethical leadership, and she had become a role model for the kind of officer I wanted to become. "You have unusual emotional intelligence for someone your age," she observed during one of our mentoring sessions. "Most people your age haven't yet learned to distinguish between relationships that serve them and relationships that exploit them. You have that wisdom already." Her comment prompted reflection on the source of that wisdom. My parents' betrayal had accelerated my emotional development in some ways, forcing me to confront harsh realities about human nature and family dynamics that many people never have to face directly. The experience had been traumatic, but it had also been educational in ways that no formal training could replicate. I had learned that love without conditions is rare but possible, that loyalty should be reciprocal rather than one-sided, and that family is defined by behavior rather than biology. These lessons had cost me the illusions of childhood, but they had also equipped me to build adult relationships based on realistic expectations and mutual respect. The officer candidate school graduation ceremony took place on a crisp autumn morning 18 months later. As I stood in formation with my fellow new officers, taking the oath of commission that would define the next phase of my military career, I thought briefly about my parents and the path that had led me to this moment. They had wanted to profit from my death, but their betrayal had instead catalyzed my growth into someone stronger, wiser, and more successful than I might have become without their harsh lesson in human nature. Their criminal fraud had freed me from the obligation to seek their approval or maintain their version of family unity, allowing me to focus entirely on my own development and chosen relationships. The irony was not lost on me. By trying to cash in on my supposed death, they had given me a more authentic life than I had ever experienced while seeking their love and acceptance. Their betrayal had been the foundation of my liberation. As the ceremony concluded and I received my commission as a second lieutenant, I was surrounded by colleagues, mentors, and friends who had come to celebrate this milestone in my career. These were people who valued my success, supported my ambitions, and trusted me with their own vulnerabilities because they understood that genuine relationships require mutual investment and care. Looking around at their faces, people who had chosen to be part of my life and whom I had chosen in return, I realized that my parents had been right about one thing: I was worth more to them dead than alive. But what they had failed to understand was that I was worth more to myself alive than dead, surrounded by people who celebrated my achievements rather than calculating their potential profit from my demise. They had held a funeral for the daughter they had raised, the one who had sought their approval and made excuses for their exploitation. That daughter had indeed died, replaced by someone who understood the difference between family and relatives, between love and manipulation, between support and exploitation. The woman who had walked into her own funeral in full military uniform was gone too, replaced by an officer who no longer needed to prove her worth to people who had never properly valued her life. I had evolved beyond their capacity to hurt or help me, beyond their ability to diminish or validate my accomplishments. 5 years after their arrest, I stood in dress blues receiving a commendation for exceptional leadership during a training exercise, surrounded by the family I had chosen and built through years of mutual respect and genuine care. In the audience sat colleagues who had become lifelong friends, mentors who had invested in my success, and fellow officers who trusted my judgment and valued my presence. My parents were not there, of course. They had forfeited the right to witness my achievements when they chose to declare me dead for insurance money. But their absence didn't diminish the moment or create any sense of loss. The relationships that mattered were present, celebrating an accomplishment that belonged entirely to the life I had built beyond their influence. As I accepted the award and looked out at the faces of people who had become my true family, I realized that my parents had given me the greatest gift possible, though not the one they had intended. By betraying me so completely, they had freed me to discover what genuine love and loyalty actually looked like. They had wanted to profit from my death, but instead they had taught me how to live. And I had learned that lesson well. That's where I'll leave it for now. I'm moving forward with clear boundaries and the people who've earned a place in my life. If this resonated, subscribe for more true stories about standing your ground and share this with someone who needs it. Questions for you. Have you ever had to confront family over money or a lie? What did you do? Where's your line between forgiveness and accountability? If you discovered a similar fraud, would you go public or handle it quietly? What's one boundary you set that changed everything? Who counts as family to you today and why? Drop your answers in the comments. Your story might help someone else speak up.